What ABCD is about is it's about an invitation from the edge that says, let's look at the half full rather than the half empty part of the glass. Let's start here and build on that, not so that we can ignore the half empty part of the glass, but so that we can mobilize citizens to be at the center of democracy, to be citizens, to be producers of their own future and co-producers of their own future. And so that the state and the different limbs of the state and the third sector can journey with them, but not come in to fix them, not do it for them, but really have a genuine co-production. We've seen two kinds of communities. We've seen grants communities and we've seen asset communities. And grants communities are communities that say, we have nothing in here. You know, we have, you know, really nothing to build with. So if anything is going to get better around here, it's because somebody out there is going to come in and make it better. And then we have all of these stories that say, well, you know what, actually we've got lots of things around here, and it's when we connect them that we become stronger. So the grants communities, I think, were communities where they were saying, we have nothing, give us something. They get something in the form of a grant, and then they spend it down. And asset communities were communities that started with something very small, you know. It could be a little bit of passion. It could be 4 people who wanted to do something that summer for girls who had nothing to do, and so they set up a summer program. You know, it could be as simple as that. But by building the connections and the assets, they took something very small and they made it very big. So you see the contrast. Grants communities have a lot, and by the time they're finished, they have nothing at all. So next year they've got to go back, prove they're doubly needy, and get more money to sustain themselves. Whereas asset communities are communities that start with what they have and build up. And it shifts the conversation in a very real way. It's now no longer a conversation about scarcity, but it's a conversation about abundance. It's a conversation about possibility. It's no longer a conversation about blame, but it's a conversation about ownership. And it's really a conversation about how people from the grassroots have, in a very handmade and in a very homemade way, built their neighborhood up. I think, I mean, obviously careless society is it's a critique of consumer society. Not a criticism or a judgment, but a critique. And he's critiquing systems, he's critiquing big institutions, but he's also critiquing society itself in a sense. And he's saying that in a way what we've done is we've taken an awful lot of our needs and an awful lot of the things that we used to do in times past, and we've farmed them out to the edge, to professionals to look after. And that's part of the consumer society, you know. So in the 1900s, if you needed shoes, you went to a cobbler, and the cobbler measured your feet, and he made you a pair of shoes that lasted for 5 years. And in the process, he would have noticed that your left foot, you know, maybe your big toe was a little bit larger and a little bit more crooked than that on your right foot, and so would cut the leather just so that it allowed for that accommodation to happen. And now we're in a situation where in consumer society, you go and you buy 5 shoes over a 5-year period that don't quite fit you as well as the handmade version, the local version. And often you end up with a situation where you have 4 pairs of shoes that you don't really need, you know. So in a sense, that metaphor in the marketplace is a useful metaphor also in the world of managed care. Because there are 2 ways to a good life, if you like, to a big society, to a caring society. And I think, by the way, you know, with regard to big society, we need to think much more about substance rather than size. So it's interesting to think about how a big society could be a caring society. Care in a big society comes from people. It doesn't come from programs, and it doesn't come from services. And often it can't be managed, you know, because care is the freely given gift of the heart, one person to another. I care about Colleen, my wife, more than anybody else in the world. Nobody pays me to do that. I don't have to do that. There isn't a political sanction if I don't do that. There are consequences, but not in the world of systems. That's my civic space. That's the space where I have friendships and I have associations. And I am me. I am in flow and I can be a passionate individual. So he argues that that's where we need to look to. If we're trying to figure out some of the really serious social fabric issues of our time. That's where we need to look to if we're trying to understand about how we can be a safer society, how we can be a healthier society. So I think what John is saying is that really a lot of the solutions to the problems that we're facing as society actually exist in the community way, not in the systems way. And we've gotten that confused. We've farmed an awful lot of what we have dealt with in the past out to the systems. And the systems can't cope. They have reached the limit of what they can do. Great institutions have begun to recognize that they cannot do our living for us. The government can't do our push-ups for us, and it can't do our living for us, and it can't do our dying for us either. We have to do that. So in a sense, it seems to me that what John is saying in Careless Society is we need to figure out how we become caring again and where the domain of care lies. Systems, institutions, the state, they provide services, very important, very valid services. But communities, families, neighborhoods is where care is created. When we forget that, we move from a big society to a careless society. We move from being citizens to being consumers. And we wake up in the morning crouched over kindling, and you say, well, what are you doing? And the answer is, I'm waiting for somebody to light my fire. Somebody out there who's going to take my life and make it something. I'm waiting for somebody out there to make this big society. And the reality is in a democracy, in a real democracy, people make big society. Citizens make big society. So it seems to me that one of the things we need to figure out around the big society debate is who does what, where, and when, and how that kind of relates to a partnership and to a relationship. A big part of the big society debate, I think, will be, well, co-production is the answer. And that seems right to me, but it's not the whole story. I think co-production is really important because it helps us to figure out, as I said, how power can become infinite, how we can actually build a deep democracy where citizens are at the centre, where citizens are the landlords, and Westminster are the servants. But they're in a servant leadership role. And the third sector are there in partnership with them. So I think that's important. When you're convening a conversation like this, I think it is important that it's the government and the third sector that do the convening and invest in that convening. Not so that they can dominate it. It has to be an invitation rather than a mandate. You must come and talk about big society, and if you don't, you won't get any funding. That's not going to work, actually, because of what I've said. It's the citizens who give birth to big society. So I think that the role of government and the role of third sector is to mobilize a conversation. I think in every county, in every local authority, for example, if the city manager convenes a meeting, the great benefit of that is people will come. And I think if the right methodologies are used, like World Cafe and appreciative inquiry and asset mapping, I think we could have the most amazing conversation that shifts people from being consumers, that shifts people from being passive recipients waiting for the great white knight to ride over the hill and save the day, to being citizens, to being the most powerful people in democracy, but also being the people who tell government, we are government. We are government, and this is how we're moving forward. And I think in that sense, you don't end up with just a size debate. You end up with a discussion about deep democracy, and you end up with a discussion about sustainable communities all at once. So you've got the local and you've got the national. And I think with real good intentional thinking and good facilitation, something like that could happen over the next few months. You've got the infrastructure, you've got the architecture to do it. And if the third sector can pull together with the government on this, wow, imagine the conversation and imagine the outcome. My sense of it is that what is great about the strength-based movement, because it's not just ABCD, you know, it's appreciative inquiry, open space, and there's a whole range of other methodologies that I think are sister methodologies to ABCD that are saying, let's build a bridge between people who are on the margins and the center of community life. That's quite distinct, you know, from building a bridge between people who are on the margins and services, you know. So now I think what we're seeing is a reframing. You know, for a long time, we addressed vulnerable people by connecting them to services that were given by professionals. And I think more and more now professionals are beginning to realize that real support is a support whereby we can connect people with their own contributions, regardless of how society might label them, and also the opportunities in community in a very real way in the place that we call home. So for me, a lot of what ABCD has to offer is that bridge building piece that says, let's intentionally, rather than assuming that we have a hostile community that wants to reject its most vulnerable, let's assume that if we have a conversation of invitation with every resident, that, okay, not all residents and not all associations and not all businesses will want to address the question of inclusion, but many will. And my experience is, you know, from football clubs to knitting clubs to very large businesses, there's a huge reservoir of care out there that isn't being tapped and potentially could be. I suspect the reason it isn't being tapped is because we have a paradigm that says that if we can bring people from the edge into our offices and we can somehow support them there and then aggregate them with each other, so we've got all these youth at risk with other youth at risk, and somehow we think that's social inclusion because we teach them a little bit about advocacy and mobilizing. And my sense of it is that's just part of the whole story, that the other part is helping young people in this example to connect with productive adults, to connect with community, and helping community to really see that young people are our future, that they're not deviant or deserving of charity, that they're active citizens, that they're leaders of today, not leaders of tomorrow. And it's the same with, I think, with people with disabilities or people, you know, that are going through probation. Because as society, we've labeled them, we've farmed them out to the margins, and we're saying to professionals, now you look after them because we don't know what to do with them. But when you have, I think, intentional conversations with people, with citizens, and you say, you know, what do you care about enough to actually do something about? You'll find a lot of people on the doorsteps will say, well, you know, I'm really worried about the fact that I live in a community where an awful lot of the older people in this community are afraid. They're prisoners in their own homes. And I'd really like to do something about that. But, you know, I can't go up and knock on their door, so I don't know how to make the connection. And I think part of our job in the third sector is to hear that and in some way to serve as bridge builders. And say, well, you know, what do we need to do? How can we support you to do that very laudable thing that you want to do? And to trigger that passion is part, I think, of the challenge that we're facing into, actually. As great institutions start to crumble, we're beginning to realize that a lot of this is actually in our own hands. But we don't connect like we did in the past. So there's a piece around how we can support those connections. And I think for me, that sense of really recognizing that people on the margins they're our test, I think. They're our acid test to how strong we are as a community. Because I really believe that a community that doesn't have a place for people on the margins has a place for no one.